Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Teddy Noy, and welcome to our continuing the discussion segment for Exodus chapter 24. In our last study, we explored the heart of this chapter as the great covenant sealing moment at Sinai. We walked through the ceremony, the blood ritual, the meal in God's presence, and the awesome vision, His glory of the mountain. But as with so many parts of the Bible, the more you linger here, the more you realize there's even more under the surface. Layers we didn't have time to explore in the main deep dive. That's what our topic for today is. We're going to press further into the topics we've touched on only lightly, and some we didn't address at all. These are details that not only illuminate this chapter, but help us see the covenant at Sinai in its full historical and theological richness. So let's begin with something we only glanced at, the literary structure of Exodus 24. The more you study this chapter, the more you realize it's not just a narrative account thrown together in chronological order. It's actually a carefully constructed literary bridge between two major sections of Exodus: the giving of the law in chapters 19 through 23, and the instructions for binding the tabernacle in chapters 25 onward. In other words, Exodus 24 is the hinge on which the Sinai narrative turns, and it's written in a way that mirrors ancient covenant-making accounts, but with deliberate theological twists. You have the public reading and assent in verses 3 through 7, the sacrificial blood rite in verses 5 through 8, and the covenant meal in verses 9 through 11. Then the narrative shifts. It shifts gears into Moses' ascent and God's glory in verses 12 through 18, which sets up the next section. Scholars have noted that the chapter has a chastic or mirrored structure where certain ideas are repeated in reverse order to draw attention to the center point. Here, that center is the covenant meal, the moment when human beings eat and drink in the presence of God. In other words, the structure itself says that this is what covenant is for: fellowship with God. Now let's talk anthropology. In the ancient Near East, covenants weren't just legal contracts. They were relational bonds, often forged in blood. The kind of ritual you see in Exodus 24, the sprinkling of blood on both the altar and the people, fits within that what anthropologists call blood brotherhood ceremonies. In these, the shedding and sharing of blood symbolizes the merging of two parties into one family. In tribal societies, that could mean merging two clans. Here, it's the merging of the nation of Israel with the God who redeems them. Blood in this context is not about gore, it's about life. By sharing blood, each party is pledging life itself to the other. This is why the New Testament letter to the Hebrews sees this moment as a direct foreshadowing of the new covenant in Christ's blood. It's about union, belonging, and a life for life bond. But there's another angle to blood ritual that we didn't touch before. Its political implications. In the ancient world, a suzerain vassal treaty was a political document. It said, "We are now in a binding relationship. I, the suzerain, will protect you, and you, the vassal, will serve me faithfully." At Sinai, God is adopting Israel, but He's also becoming their sovereign king. That's why Exodus 24 blends political and familial imagery. Israel is both servant and child. This duality identity will run all through the New Testament, with God sometimes speaking as the protective king, other times as the loving father, and sometimes as both in the same breath. But now let's press into something that's easy to miss: the presence of the 70 elders. In our last deep dive, we noted that they saw God and lived, but we didn't explore why 70 and why elders. The number 70 in the Bible often symbolizes completeness, or the fullness, or the full representation of a community. In Genesis 10, there are 70 nations listed after the flood, representing the whole world. In Numbers 11, God tells Moses to appoint 70 elders to share the burden of leadership. Here in Exodus 24, 70 elders represent the whole people of Israel before God. This is not just a private vision for Moses, it's a shared experience meant to authenticate the covenant to the entire nation. The presence of the elders says this covenant is for all of us, and we all stand as witness. And what about what they see? Under God's feet is something like a pavement of sapphire, or more precisely, lapis lazuli. Lapis was not just a beautiful blue stone, it was a symbol of divine authority across the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconography, gods and kings were often depicted sealed on thrones of blue stone or standing on blue pavements to signify their heavenly authority. In detail, the detail of Exodus 24 says, in effect, quote, "We saw the King of the universe, and his throne room was unlike anything on earth. That image would stay with Israel's imagination for centuries. You hear echoes of it in Ezekiel's vision of God's throne, and even in Revelation's description of the heavenly city." Another area we didn't explore before is the relationship between the book of the covenant Moses reads and the tablets God promises to give him. The book of the covenant in verse 7 almost certainly refers to the laws given in Exodus chapters 20 through 23. These are written down by Moses and read aloud to the people. But the tablets of stone in verse 12 are something else. They are God's own writing, the divine signature on the covenant. In the ancient Near East, a treaty might be inscribed in stone or clay to show its permanence here. God himself is the scribe. That dual witness, the human written record and the divine engraved record, underscores the unbreakable nature of the covenant. Now, from a historical critical perspective, scholars have debated whether Exodus 24 is a single unified event or the weaving together of different covenant traditions. Some point out that verses 1 through 9 both describe Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders going up the mountain, which could suggest two visions of the same event merged together. Others note that the sequence of reading, sacrificing, and ascending might have been recorded for theological purposes. Whether or not that's one case, what's clear is that the final form of the text presents the covenant as a multi-layered event involving the whole community, the leaders, and Moses as the mediator. So now let's step into the cloud for a moment. The description of God's glory on the mountain. Covered by a cloud for 6 days before he calls Moses on the seventh is rich in symbolism. 6 days of waiting and a climactic seventh day mirrors the creation account. 6 days of God's creative work followed by the Sabbath. The message is that this covenant is a new creation. Israel is being remade as God's people. Just as the world was made in Genesis 1, the 40 days and nights Moses spends in God's presence echo other biblical periods of testing and transformation. Noah in the ark, Elijah's journey to Horeb, Jesus' fast in the wilderness. In each case, 40 is not just a number. It's a symbol of completeness in divine preparation. One of the deeper theological threads we didn't follow before is the way Exodus 24 sets up the entire theology of God's dwelling with his people. Immediately after this chapter, in Exodus 25, God begins giving detailed instructions for the tabernacle. The covenant is not just about law, it's about presence. God's goal is not merely to rule Israel from a distance, but to live among them. That's why the covenant ceremony ends with a meal fellowship before moving into plans for a dwelling place. In the biblical narrative, law and presence always go together. Obedience without presence is just legalism. Presence without obedience becomes presumption. The covenant holds both together. Now here's a piece we haven't touched at all yet. How later Jewish tradition viewed this scene. In rabbinic literature, the covenant at Sinai is sometimes compared to a wedding, with God as the groom and Israel as the bride. The blood of the covenant is like the blood of a marriage covenant, and the meal of the mountain is like the wedding feast. In this reading, Exodus 24 is not just a treaty, it's a marriage vow. The imagery appears in the prophets, especially Hosea and Jeremiah, who speak of Israel's unfaithfulness in terms of marital betrayal and God's restoration in terms of renewing vows. In Christian interpretation, this marriage imagery also carries forward. The Last Supper is often seen as the renewal of covenant vows, but this time with the church as the bride of Christ. Revelation picks up the theme with the marriage supper of the Lamb. In that sense, the meal in Exodus 24 is the first foreshadowing of the ultimate covenant feast in God's kingdom. Another overlooked element is the role of Aaron and his sons Nadab and Abihu. This is one of the high points of their story. They are invited into God's presence along with Moses, but just a few chapters later, Nadab and Abihu will offer unauthorized fire before the Lord and be struck down. The juxtaposition is striking. Access to God's presence is the highest honor, but it carries the highest responsibility. This theme runs all through Scripture. Intimacy with God is a gift, but it must be received with reverence. Finally, let's consider the political theology of this moment. At Sinai, Israel is effectively becoming a nation. They have laws, they have a sovereign, they have leaders, and now they have a formal covenant binding them together. But unlike other nations of the time, their king is invisible, their constitution is divine, and their national identity is rooted in worship. This is what sets Israel apart, and this is what will make their story both glorious and tragic. When they keep covenant, they flourish beyond all expectations. But when they break it, the consequences are devastating. So where does this leave us? For me, the continuing discussion of Exodus 24 deepens the sense that this is not just an ancient ritual, but a defining moment in the relationship between God and his people. It's about identity, belonging, responsibility, and above all, presence. It's about a God who is both king and father, who invites his people to share a meal in his presence, and who also binds himself to them with promises written in blood. And here's the question I want to leave with you. If you were there that day, if you saw the sapphire pavement, heard the voice of God, felt the mist of the mountain cloud, what would you have done when you came back down? Would you live differently, speak differently, love differently, knowing that you were a part of a covenant sealed by the very life of God? That's the challenge Exodus 24 still puts to us today. Thank you for joining me for this extended look at the Exodus 24. If something in this chapter, in this deep dive, stirred you or got you thinking deeper or gave you a new perspective, I want to hear it. I would love, drop a comment below. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you're finding value in these studies, remember to like and subscribe and to share them with others. Thank you so much. This has been Whole Bible Study with Taddy Noy. Stay curious, stay rooted, and stay in the Word. Thank you again, and we'll see you tomorrow in the next chapter.